Hey, welcome to Relaxation Book Club. I'm Jonathan,
And I'm Bella.
and we'll be talking about the lottery and things fall apart. So there is much in store today.
Okay, first off, we're going to talk about the lottery. It does good when doing an analysis to talk about a little bit of the background of the subject. So, the lottery was written in 1948 by Shirley Jackson. Um, she was a very interesting person, and I recommend you look her up. Um, she was known for having a library of occult things. She was at the time not considered womanly, which I find very funny.
She was probably the Stephen King of her time, just being able to sit down and write whole books in one sitting.
She always described writing as a pleasurable experience, and she was just very strong-willed for what she wanted, which I liked. I don't know if it's widely regarded, but she wrote the lottery in a single take. It's reported she went to the grocery store and came home and then wrote it in a single afternoon while looking after her daughter before her son came home from kindergarten for the day. And then she sent it off to be published in, yeah, it was 1948, same year. Um, you know, I'm not sure how to say understanding of Shirley Jackson paints the lottery because with a lot of authors you can kind of understand who they are and that paints the book. Like if you're talking about Walden and you understand Henry David Thoreau, you get a rich understanding of the viewpoints of Walden. It's not quite a thing with the lottery. Shirley Jackson is an interesting writer. It's not like she believed in stoning people or she was getting across strong moralistic points about this. It was just kind of an examination of civility and violence as, a combination. We like to think, at the time it was 1948, we like to think we're a civilized society, and, she was an American. But inside that civility comes the violence we use to uphold that civilization. And I think that's part of the thing she was trying to get across with the lottery. But it's also, at its core, a fucked up story about stoning.
Yeah, the lottery brings strong, like, I have such a negative response when I'm reading the lottery, especially the ending. Like, it just makes me mad to my core. Like, when I'm reading, and that's probably was her intention.
Exactly.
So she did what she needed to do to get that reaction, and that's fine. But let's actually get a little bit into the story itself. You have these people that get together every year around June.
Yeah.
They have this mythos around it. They She spends what the first third of the book talking about the the traditions that rely around the black box and the lottery and did the what do they call the person who actually the lottery mint? That's not what
I
they
know
use
he's
it.
Mr. Summers. I don't know what he is.
Well, Mr. Summers, who's in charge of the lottery, they were talking about like, oh, is he supposed to walk through the crowd? Is he supposed to sing a song? Is he, have a
I wish
special salute? And I'm like,
I wish we got the version of the story that has the song in it. I would love to hear whatever insane shit they come up with.
it just blows my mind that everyone is okay with the lottery and the stoning and just nobody like okay, so on a personal level, my thing is and I looked up some stuff. If every single town in the United States was doing the lottery, every single year we would lose 108,000 people because there's 108,000 towns are bigger in the United States if you include our territories in Puerto Rico and whatever. And I'm sure when the lottery was written, it was a little bit smaller. But can you imagine? Okay, 108,000 people die every single year. Everyone should know someone who died in the lottery, and everyone's just so like giddy about like, oh, who's it going to be this year?
Well, I mean, part of it is you see right before they stone her at the end of the story. Sorry to skip ahead a little bit, but they hand the baby pebbles to throw at her. So it's something that's not bred, but it's conditioned before you're able to think for yourself that we do the lottery. We throw stones to appease a harvest god, our traditions, our
The sun
civility
god.
itself.
I mean, but there has to be some resentment. Like, how many people have lost their mother, have lost their father, lost their brother, lost their school friend? You know what I mean? Like, once a year, like, everyone has to know someone. And, like, Mr. Summers even scoffs at the idea of there are people in other towns who are
I
thinking
don't think
about
that's
getting rid of
Mr.
it.
Summers, but I think it's Old Man Mr. David or something.
Yeah, it might have not been Mr. Summers, but there are people scoffing at the idea, like, oh, what are we going to do? Go back and live in the caves? Like,
It presents such an interesting point because you can tell as the drawing happens, nobody really derives joy out of this custom. I mean, it's awkward, it's weird, it's just sort of something they do every year. Every year we have Easter. We say a bunny came and gave us eggs. Every year they stone a person.
you say they don't derive joy, but the kids were running to throw stones at
Simpson?
Mrs. Hutchison. It's like, and it's yeah, I don't know. It's
Well, I think part of that is like, for the kids, it's a tradition they've had every year, but for the adults, it's something they've been able to reflect on, and maybe they don't like it, but they see the necessity in it.
I mean, even that old man was like, everyone get over here and throw stones. Come on. And they were like, people just ain't the same the way they used to be. When they were talking about Mrs. Hutcherson, like being like, no, it's not fair, whatever. Like, oh, you're just supposed to take your stoic death, which let me just say, in this kind of society, and maybe it's me being idealistic, unrealistic on my side, but it's like even her husband like went over, grabbed the pieces of paper and was like, see, she has the dot. Like, I don't know, like I feel like I would have volunteered myself for stoning, just been like, nope, I'll take it for the family, like save my wife, save my
Yeah, I
kids.
mean,
Not like stoically like stone my wife to death. Haha, you're unlucky.
yeah, I mean, I'm with you with that. Obviously, you're not going to stone a significant person to you, but like, I feel like it breeds this sense of survival in yourself when you know every year someone has to die. I mean, not all of them can be like Old Man Warner, that's his name, who had done this for 85 years,
Oh God. Yeah.
which is just a fantastic luck streak in a village of like what, like 300 people.
Honestly, yeah. And the town used to be smaller. They talk about growing. The town is bigger now than it was.
I mean, you're almost forced to grow because as a parent, you could force your children to draw for you, which is terrible. Absolutely terrible. But at a certain level of survival, you go, if I have 10 children, I'm less likely to die personally.
But that's why I'm saying, why isn't there more social resistance to this idea of the lottery? It's like
Well,
if you've lost your mother, your brother, your father, a school friends, plural. Like at a certain point, you're probably like I don't even know that I would have showed up to the lottery. I'd have been like, psh, even if they stoned me to death for not showing up, I would have been like, you know what? I
yeah,
mean,
I would have
it's
had a go bag, just like, oh, I'm not doing it this year.
yeah, just
But I think that's part of the framing of the narrative. It's small towns are known for their adherence to tradition. That's why the lottery takes place in a small town. Because if it takes place in a big town, the story would be about the social change away from the lottery. Like they talk about in the lottery, bigger towns and cities just aren't doing it anymore. They don't believe in the lottery.
yeah,
So I think at its core, the lottery, besides about being, civility and violence and their coexistence, is about, tradition versus escape from tradition. And it just uses an abhorrent tradition to clarify that. Like to us, if it was the story about they're doing Christmas photos this year, but big towns aren't doing Christmas photos, you go, oh, that's a little weird story. But the visceral shock you feel over like reading a woman stoned to death really makes you go, is the adherence to tradition the best part of this tradition? Like, because obviously big towns are doing it and they're not all dead yet. They haven't been smited by the stone god or whatever.
yeah, no, exactly. So that's basically covers all my thoughts on the lottery. Do you have anything else you want to?
No, I think I got out most of my thoughts. I mean, yeah, I think I'm good.
All right, so we can move on to things fall apart.
Okay, so now that we've talked about the lottery, we'll move on to our discussion of things fall apart. And again, to give some of the historical context for this was written in 1958 by Chinua Achebe. Now, there have been other books before this about the colonization of Africa, like, famously Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and there are a few others I can't think of right now. But both the tone and main character of Heart of Darkness are more about a Westerner's perspective of the interior of Africa, and it brings to mind these thoughts of, like, the naive innocent native being corrupted by Western forces. But Chinua Achebe, as a native African himself, he was a Nigerian Christian. There's a fun little anecdote that I'll talk about in a minute. Chinua Achebe thought the total concept of, like, what's the word? The Flanderization? That's not the word. That's used for media analysis. Like, native tribes, like the Nigerian natives, was kind of a bad concept to roll off of. So his whole thing with Things Fall Apart was to provide an authentic Nigerian experience. Because when you read this, it's not quite obvious, but it takes place at the end of the 19th century, so like 1890s ish, right as the Christian missionaries started pushing into Africa, well, pushing into Nigeria itself. Originally, this is historical context as opposed to literature context. The British don't want to push into Nigeria. They kind of started doing it because other European nations were pushing into other African colonies. Because by this point, the British Empire had decided against using slavery for things. So they were like, okay, well, we don't really need to go into the African continent. And then suddenly a lot of countries realized Africa is very rich, and they went, okay, maybe we do need to go into the African continent.
Well, you didn't want to be the only country made fun of for not having a colony in Africa.
Well, at that point, they were still the Great British Empire. They're ripping off trillions from India. They might as well rip off trillions from Nigeria. So that's the historical context of where the book takes place, which I think is, important to look at, because the book likes to play with introducing cultural concepts of the Igbo people. And this is a sidebar, but it's either pronounced IGBO or IBO, depending on if it's the old or new. They're both pronounced Igbo. IGBO is the newer pronunciation. So when they use Igbo in the book as like IBO, it's usually as a connotation for older cultural practices. They only use IBO like 3 times in the book. Chinua Achebe himself prefers IGBO. That's a big sidebar. Doesn't need to be fully discussed, but I think it lends extra. Well, actually, you don't hear it in the audiobook. You would have to have read the other actual book. But I believe it provides context to some of these practices. Okay, so that's the historical context, the cultural context of Chinua Achebe himself. He believed in kind of showing that off because, again, at this time, I think that the best look you had was Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And that was a very skewed portrayal, skewed towards the native tribesmen, which is, I don't know if that's what
was it written by a Westerner?
Yes, Joseph Conrad. He firmly believed that, Britain and all of them had no point to be in Africa. And I'm not getting into the historical context of this, but it was, I don't know. We'll do a book club of this one day. It's a long book, I think.
So, Things Fall Apart. I think we've talked about the author. He was Nigerian. It was the first classical English wrote book coming out of Africa directly that reached a Western audience. So the book itself, we have Okonkwo. He is basically your stereotypical man in that tribe of manliness who came from nothing. His father basically set him up for a not great life. You'd agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I have my thoughts on Ngoka himself.
But either way, the point, they make it pretty clear in the book that he didn't build up anything, especially anything that he could give to his kids. He was a debtor, he was lazy, and he even died from bloating of the stomach, which is considered a curse mark of the Igbo people, and he was laid out into the evil forest to just die out there. He wasn't allowed to be buried. So Okonkwo actually had to essentially build everything that he had himself, which leads into the context of the book. And he does have an ego about himself, about the things that he's built.
A huge ego.
In fact, he takes it to the extreme, and anything that his father was, he absolutely would not be. Like they even mention in the book that Okonkwo saw the gentleness of his son as a weakness and as a mirror of his father, which is kind of sad because, he was so stoic, and I'm finger quoting here, and he would refuse to try to have any emotion because he saw that all as weakness.
And, I think, a lot of people talk about how Okonkwo's pride was his undoing. I truly think it's his complete rejection of what he considered femininity, because it's what causes him to, what is that, chapter 12, go to the forest and help kill Akim Funa.
Basically his son.
Yeah, his son he raised for years, which, throws him away from Okoye.
He got like 3 days of depression over that stuff, which I'm actually kind of surprised wasn't longer, but he just manlied it out and was like, yeah, I can kill my own son. What's it to me? I've killed 5 men before.
And it's what ultimately leads him to, because I think even when things take a turning point, and this is further in there, when his gun accidentally goes off, he's exiled. You see throughout those chapters, he gets a status about himself. He could have became an elder of that village from his mother's side, but he really thought of that as a feminine village. He thought it was full of, womanly men, and he didn't want anything to do with it because Umofia was strong and manly.
Yeah, they were the biggest village around.
Even if he was, because his whole thing is about his pride, about his status and manliness, he could have become what he wanted, but he threw it away in chase of something manlier, so to speak.
That's actually a good point. I didn't even really think about that. So when he could have took those 7 years of exile and started building himself back up, but instead he put his whole life on pause for those 7 years of exile.
Even as far as he gets like 1,000 yams from because he gets like 300 yams from each of this guy's 4 sons.
America brings it to him.
He could have, if he really wanted, built back up his wealth pretty strongly with that. That's a very strong start to a field.
In fact, he even told his daughter not to get married until they go back to the new town.
So he put everything on pause for Umofia because it was the manlier village and he wanted his status there. And, I kind of get that. That's where he built his stuff, but it's like, it even goes as far as like when he first gets there and he's depressed about being exiled, this guy talks to him about and sorry, I'm so bad with names right now because it's not Obirika, because that's from Umofia, that's his friend from Umofia, but it's a different guy. Talks to him about accepting, the feminine portions with the manly portions, because that's how you strike a balance.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of what cheered him up a little bit and started getting him onto the right track. But he still waited until he left to go back to the new town. They even talk about like when he came back, he was wanted to get his son's titles. He wanted to come back and forth. He wanted 2 more, wives. He wanted to have 5 wives. I mean, he already had 3 wives. And a lot of kids.
I don't even know what you do with that many wives, honestly.
I would literally just kill myself. Me personally, like, as someone who has 1 wife, I would literally just.
Okay, fair enough.
But anyways, it's like, but he was so wanted to build a name for himself, that ended up leading to his winding down, to his demise.
As the book says, things fall apart. Which I think is an interesting title because it's from a W.B. Yeats poem about the downfall of civilization by the Antichrist, which is what I think is funny about making a book of the downfall of civilization by Christianity and calling it Things Fall Apart. It's kind of an inversion of the concept of W.B. Yeats.
Oh yeah, I mean his culture was changing so fast around him, he just couldn't keep up, and he was fighting it so hard that even when his fellow men around him didn't want to fight the changes that were happening, he pushed for it so hard that he literally had no choice but to spoiler alert, he offed himself.
Which I think is a sad but interesting end to Okonkwo and his chase of manliness, because I don't remember which chapter, I'll take better notes next time, but it's described that suicide is a womanly way to go. So the ultimate fact that he, the manliest Umofian, has killed himself is kind of a sad way for his whole thing to end.
But think about the despair that he must have felt, because earlier in the book, on like chapter 4 or 5, they were talking about his very first harvest when he got 800 yam seeds from sharecroppers, and then he had like 400 yams himself that he saved up for, and he planted them, and it was too dry at the beginning of the season and too wet at the end of the season, and just like actually I think I got it reversed. I think it was too wet, then it was too dry.
No, it was too dry, and then when the rainy season came, it flooded and destroyed all the yams. And then everyone who didn't plant their yams yet was so smug about it.
And the other thing too is there were literally farmers. They even mentioned there was literally farmers that were driven to suicide at that moment. But Okonkwo, and they even talk about it. He took that moment, and he took that moment on the chin, and he kept on going, and he kept on building. And eventually, from that point on, that's when he started building his wealth, and he got his second wife, and then he moved on. So at the very end, he must have really thought that everything was lost. His own kinsmen became Christians. Some of them even were starting.
I think because he kills the messenger, and he sees no one's there to support him, and he goes, "Oh, my whole imagined comeback to Amofia, where I free them from the womanly, compassionate Christians, is not a thing. This culture has changed forever. I have no place here." He saw no way to rebuild himself. I think that's the key factor to it.
Well, I think the culture that he wanted to build himself around was literally disintegrating in front of him.
Yes.
It's like he wanted the titles and all that stuff. He just realized like it just didn't mean anything.
That's fair. I have a lot of thoughts on Things Fall Apart, but not particularly coming to me right now.
I mean, I kind of like Things Fall Apart. I actually liked it. This is my second read of Things Fall Apart, maybe 4 or 5 times, because we had to listen to the audiobook like 6 or 7 times to try to get it on YouTube. But I find it interesting because while I do not defend colonialism, and I'm going to preface this because I really don't, I like how the book doesn't necessarily just make the Christian seem like an absolute evil bad guy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what I like so much about Chinua Achebe. He wasn't, and I think that's part of what made Things Fall Apart catch on so hard. It's not about the moralization of the fact. It's kind of a presentation of facts, and I think part of the fun of it is it takes on this very cold, omniscient narrator until the very end. And you can kind of see through what's his face. I really need to take better notes. Unmasks in a goo, therefore killing the elder spirit. And they want to burn down a church and burn down his houses, and they do that. And when they resummon the leaders, they just handcuff them before they can even start talking about why they did any of that. So it kind of brings to bear this concept of like, the church isn't necessarily a bad thing. They're doing decent things for the people. But at the same time, the bringing of, quote unquote civilization, a new court system, a new all this to, as the district commissioner puts it, pacify the tribes of Lower Niger, is not necessarily anything but a misguided gesture.
And I get it, but I mean, also looking from, I would think, an objective point of view too. And the book shows, I would say, some of the other sides of the native culture itself, such as we've discussed this, the twins have to be tossed down to the evil forest, the babies that they think are just rebirthing evil spirits, so they mutilate the babies to try to be like, oh, so that evil spirit won't come back again. And they even mentioned that the Christians were adopting twins and taking on these kids at the village. Actually, one of the I think the strongest converts was someone who was basically chastised by the village, who had no ability to take on any titles whatsoever, and they gave him a new shake at life.
Exactly, and I think again that's part of what I think Chinua Achebe goes to talk about. It's like colonization is often a carrot and stick approach. We present you with things your native culture or resources don't have, and then tie it inextricably to our stuff. So, like, first it's, the Christianization, and then they bring in, like, they talk about on the 7th day, on Sunday, we have church. and that's a I don't know what to call it other than interesting kind of conversion because the Igbo people only have 4 days. So from that point forward, if you're Christian, you're working off a completely different calendar than your other clansmen. It's kind of a separation of families at that point. And that's part of why like it works so well because they separate the community and then they bring they bring strife. Like the new Christian converts are seen multiple times through the later chapters trying to rile up the old other clansmen to try and bring them into the fold. And then it ends with, the new trade system is kind of a way to make them helpless in a way. Because you think like, oh, well, they're making more money than they had. They already had money. They had the was calories the original money, or was that
Calories is
okay? Yeah, they had a money system. That's another aspect of civilization. They think they're bringing the Igbo people.
Yeah.
They think they're bringing medicine. They think they're bringing like judicial systems and like governance. It's like they already had these things before.
Yeah, but I think there's people in there that might disagree with some of their traditions already, such as even Okonkwo, right after he got exiled, he briefly thought, and it's so funny because they only gave 2 sentences to it, but it kind of stuck with me. He even briefly thought about, you know, it's unfair, this tradition that is being exiled, and it's unfair. He in the same thought, he was like, but it's also unfair to put twins out into the evil forest and just let them die. So even someone as Okonkwo, as hard, who believes in his culture as much as he does, even had doubts about some of the ways certain things were happening, and that is the route that the Christians ended up taking to try to win people over, right, wrong, or indifferent. Um, so yeah, I mean, it is a sad story. I ain't changing that.
I mean, Obiorka is usually the foil they bring for that. Okonkwo's a more level-headed friend from Umofia. He's traditionally the one, like, he had twins that were thrown out of the evil forest. He's the, like, when the Christians show up, he's the first one to go, well, maybe they have a good point.
No.
And, I think that's part of the core concept of things fall apart. It's like, at the end of the day, this is kind of a demolition of culture, but the culture isn't 100% right, which I think is a point he wanted to get across because of Joseph Conrad's work. I mean, again, he was trying to dispel the myth of the innocent, naive native who got corrupted by, like, Western, like, colonialism. And, like, part of that, and this is actually more of a side note, really, things like Joseph Conrad's work, the white characters are the ones that have full blown, thoughts and characterizations, while the natives are kind of facsimiles. And he switches that for this, where we only really know the tribesmen, and all we know about Mr. Smith and Mr. Brown is the type of preachers they are. Mr. Brown, the original one, he was a very compassionate man. He liked to talk to the leaders about their religions and stuff and how they like interact and like counteract each other. And Mr. Smith is just hardcore by the book. If you don't do this, you're going to hell.
Yeah.
And that's all we know about these characters. And I think that was kind of a fun little inversion Chinua Achebe does.
I mean, overall, I think it's just a good book. I mean, like, I think even if you get rid of all this philosophical stuff, I just think it was a good book. I enjoyed listening to it again. And I mean, honestly, I think as far as my thoughts I have right as of right this second, I think I've pretty much spilled my soul on what I think about this book. Did you have anything else you really wanted to?
Yeah, I wanted to get a little bit more into more of how he presents the Western portion. I mean, like they talk about in chapter 17, I think, ballparking here, might be 16, pretty sure it's 17. The white man who comes in on a bicycle and the oracle kills him, so they kill his entire village. That's based off real events. That was the thing. A white man went into a village, was killed, and then they formed a party to kill everyone in the village, and that spiraled into an entire pacification party from the British, like colonialists, who then went on to kill a whole lot of Igbo tribes. It didn't just end with one village like it does in the book. So I think with things like that, he's trying to hearken it to actual events. Because again, this is not quite a historical fiction piece, but it's close enough. He's trying to mimic historical fiction without being historical fiction.
Oh yeah, I mean, in history, there's all kinds of bad things that happened in Africa during colonialization. I ain't trying to defend
I
anything.
know. I'm not saying I'm not pitching you as very pro-Britain, fuck the Igbo. I'm just like, I'm trying to give contextualization to an American audience who was not there when the book was written. So, cultural context that you would have understood in the 1958 when this was written is now lost on our 2020 audience. So I think it's important to bring these things to light.
Yeah, absolutely, and there are. I mean, it happened.
I will say, and this is maybe my closing thoughts on this book. I do think it's fun that the book carries an omniscient narrator until the very end, where the nameless district commissioner goes, "Oh, I could write a paragraph about this guy," after we've read an entire book on this man. And it's kind of, again,
It's worse than that. He's like, I could write a paragraph, and then he goes down to, well, as a good book writer, you gotta weed out someone, so maybe a good couple of sentences, and you're like, holy crap! Like this man, we literally spent what 5 hours reading this book, 300 something pages, and you were talking about we can boil his life down to 3 sentences.
And I think that's, again, trying to tackle the greater cultural concept, because a lot of the writings of Britain about Nigeria at the time were just simply, oh, the Igbo tribe is backwards, they do this. And he was trying to show you that, like, a lot of what you read at the time has no cultural or historical basis on what the Igbo actually think, or any of the other African tribes. But I think Chinua Achebe is mostly concerned with the Igbo position. Not position, but viewpoint.
Well, that's where he came from. He's a Nigerian author. So.
But no, sorry. Before we stop, this is the anecdote I hinted at and forgot about. Mr. Brown is based off a preacher that Chinua Achebe's parents actually knew, who came to his tribe when he was young. The very compassionate preacher.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought that was fun. That guy actually wrote about the Igbo people, and I think that's part of why Chinua Achebe puts in that last bit, because that guy said that the Igbo people's actions are not based in logic at all. They have no reason behind them. Despite being a very compassionate preacher that listened to the Igbo traditions and did all this and that, I just thought that was an interesting background note for why things fall apart is like that.
Wow.
So even when they listen with compassion, they don't truly believe the Igbo are in any way intelligent, because they have their entire cultural position they are already sitting on from Britain. To them, they come from buildings and all this, and they go, "Oh, you live in huts? You're fucking primitive dipshits."
I'm starting to feel like the more we talk about this, the more we can keep talking about it and just keep going hours. I mean, this one book has so much content.
I mean, when you start with a classic, it's a classic for a reason. It has a large context behind it that you can. I mean, I'm pretty sure you could write a thesis paper about this book if you really wanted.
Yeah, I would agree. All right, well, you heard it here. Relaxation Book Club presents.
We would love to hear your individual thoughts in the comments. We'll try and respond when we can.
Yeah, and go listen to the lottery now. Go listen to Things Fall Apart, and go listen when we release it next week. Go listen to Dorian Gray.
Yeah, we have Dorian Gray coming up. We have Of Mice and Men, and we've got a few more classics after that. I'm really excited for the novel after Dorian Gray. Though I am excited for Dorian Gray.
Which one is after Dorian Gray?
I was trying to leave it as a surprise. We're doing Dracula.
Okay. Dracula.
It's going to be so good.
Yeah, that's a real classic. All right. Well, thank you all for being here, and we'll see you next time.